Today we're going to be checking out the Sentry Tube channel strip by Universal Audio, and this is a fantastic plugin for adding character and vibe to your tracks. It's also great for general tone shaping to push those tracks closer to the ideal sound that you're going for, especially when you're recording through the stock preamps on your interface. Now, one of the great features about this plugin is that it has a very simple and easy to use interface, and this allows you to quickly get those tones that you're going for without being bogged down with a bunch of extra knobs and settings and a bunch of adjusting. Also, if you have one of Universal Audio's interfaces, whether it's an Apollo interface or even one of their Volt interfaces, or you have the Spark subscription, then you already have this plugin and you may have been overlooking it just like I was. If we jump in my session here, I have the plugin pulled up and you can see we have different sections here as you would on a channel strip. So we have a tube preamp right here. We have an EQ section. We have an Opto Compressor leveler section right here. And we have the master section. We're going to take a closer look at each of these sections, see what they sound like. We're going to use it on a drum bus. I really feel like that gives a good idea of what's going on with that. We'll also listen to it on bass. And then also what I like to do with channel strips like this is put an instance on every single track of my recorded session as if it's a recording console, tweak my tones a little bit, and then we're going to turn it off and on and kind of just hear what it's doing to the entire session. All right, so let's take a closer look at each of these sections on this channel strip. So we have our tube preamp right here, and we have the low and high input right here. Of course, that's just going to raise or lower the incoming signal, just depending on what you need. We do have an overload or clipping light here. That's not going to indicate that you're actually like digitally clipping. It's kind of just saying, hey, some saturation and distortion, some analog stuff is starting to happen, right? So that's what that is. However, I usually don't get that turning red at all when I'm using it personally. I save that for later. All right, so jumping down here, we have these switches. The first switch we have is the mic and line input. Typically, I'd say I'm almost always in line mode right here. That's great for anything that you've already recorded. So you have like a Volt interface or a Focusrite interface, and you've recorded some tracks, you just want to throw this on there, then you're probably going to be in line mode. When you switch to mic, it gets very loud, starts clipping very quickly, all those kinds of things. However, the mic switch is great if you have like an Apollo interface and you have this plug-in on the unison slot. You can track through that. Then you're going to want to be on the mic side of things if you're recording vocals, acoustic guitar, stuff like that. So, but generally speaking, I'm on line mode. Next, we have our high pass filter, and that rolls off at 80 hertz, 12 dB per octave right there. So pretty standard on that. And then we have our polarity switch, and then we have our pad switch. One thing to note about the pad switch, it only works when you're in mic mode. So if I click here in line mode, it does not work. If I switch to mic mode, now I can engage that if I want to. All right, next up we have our level, and this is pretty self-explanatory. Turn it up to get more saturation, distortion, turn it down to get less. So pretty straightforward there. Again, that's kind of the whole concept of this plugin. So let's check out what this tube preamp section sounds like on our drum bus. All right, so as you can tell, definitely can get some overdrive, some saturation, distortion, things going like that. However, typically when I'm using this, I like for that overload light right here by the level knob, kind of just a flicker, maybe just a little bit more. It's pretty subtle, but just adding a little bit of saturation. I feel like as we start adding EQ and compression, it becomes a little more apparent. Again, I'm not trying to totally change the sound of my drums. I'm trying to just enhance them just a little bit. I've got great sounding recorded tracks. I'm trying to just give them a little bit of more mojo, a little more character. So let's move on to the EQ section. We have 3 bands of EQ right here. We have a fixed 10 kilohertz on the top end. We have a fixed 110 hertz on the low end. And then here in the mid frequencies, we have variable 300 hertz to 7.2K. And all of these are plus or minus 12 dB on each of these bands. So let's go ahead and kick the EQ on and just kind of see what that sounds like on our drum bus. All right, so very simple EQ, but very effective. A couple things I like about this EQ. First of all, that fixed 10K at the very top. That's a great frequency. I like using that a lot for adding top end. If you notice, as I pushed it all the way to plus 12 dB, it didn't get real harsh or brittle or anything like that. It still stayed fairly pleasant and musical, so that's really nice. I wouldn't push it that far, especially on this, but it's nice to know that it's not going to get too crazy and harsh on you. Also, in the mid-range, I like that we have a variable mid-range. That's really handy for kind of just targeting some problem areas that typically come up. All right, so let's talk about a couple things I don't like about this EQ in particular. Mainly the 110 hertz on the low end. That's a great frequency for like maybe boosting some low end on a bass guitar, but I feel like on kick drum, it's not quite low enough. Maybe 80, 60, somewhere around there would be really nice to have. If you notice when I boosted that 110, that kick drum kind of just sounded boxy. It didn't sound very punchy, right? It kind of sounded weird, not like a kick drum I'd want. I wish that this had like a switch here for 110 or maybe 80 or maybe 60, something like that, where you could just switch back and forth. Also, kind of similarly on the mid-range right here, I wish this went down a little bit closer to 200 instead of stopping at 300. There's sometimes for guitars and other things like that, 200 range, I like to reach down to there and kind of tweak some things. But I also understand, again, that this is supposed to be a very simple plugin, very quick and easy to use, not a lot of extra features and functions, so you don't get the analysis paralysis. Just grab it, start tweaking, stay creative, keep moving, right? So not a deal killer. I could always just save kick drum low end for mix time or something like that, right, if I wanted to. All right, so let's move on to the compressor. So we have the optical compressor here. Probably think something like an LA two-way, right? Simple optical compressor, but this is even more simple. Go ahead and kick that in right there. That's pretty self-explanatory. We have less compression, we have more compression. So let's hear what this compressor sounds like on these drums. Now, when I am using this compressor on this channel strip, typically I just have it set so it's hitting 1 dB of compression, maybe 1.5 or 2, something like that. For these drums, if you notice, as I pushed it further, it kind of lost the transient a little bit. Of course, on drums, I probably don't want that. Maybe for some crushed room effects, maybe, but not for a drum kit like this. It works really well for bass, which we'll listen to in just a second. Works great for vocals, things like that. But typically, again, this is like our recording phase, so I'm not wanting to totally change the sound. I'm kind of just tucking things in, kind of just tweaking. So I usually hit like around 1 dB, maybe 2 dB on the tracks when I'm using the compressor. And then for our last section, we have our master output. This is just a volume out. So turn it up for more volume, turn it down for less volume. We're not going to really listen to that because it doesn't really change anything other than just the volume level. All right, so now that we've kind of run through all the different sections of the channel strip, let's take a listen to see what this is actually doing to our drum bus. So we'll listen to it on and off. A couple things to keep in mind. First of all, again, I'm not trying to like really change the sound of my drums. I'm kind of just trying to enhance them, give them a little bit of character and a little bit of mojo, right? Also, keep in mind, I did not add any EQ because I don't think this really needs any EQ for the drum bus itself. So that's going to be even more subtle. But do listen to the kick drum. When it's engaged, it does get, in my opinion, gets quite a bit fuller. It has a little bit more impact. Just sounds a little bit more there. Also, the snare drum will get more character. There'll be a little bit more ring, a little bit more sustain throughout the snare drum on this as well. So let's take a quick listen. All right, so like I said, a bit subtle, especially if you're listening on a phone. Definitely recommend a good pair of headphones or speakers, but there's definitely some character being added there. And as you add this across all your different tracks, those little things really start to add up. All right, now let's take a listen to what it sounds like on bass guitar, which is a completely different thing from drums, so it's kind of a nice difference here. I'll tweak some settings, change some things so you kind of hear what's going on. Won't go quite the same detail on this, but definitely get a good feel of what it sounds like on bass. All right, so with that input, you can definitely start to get some saturation, distortion, kind of add some edge and stuff like that to your bass if you want to, or you can keep it pretty clean. EQ, lots of options. If you noticed on there, when I pushed that 110, that was actually a really good frequency for that low end on the bass. It didn't sound weird or boxy or anything like that. So I like that 110 for bass, not so much for kick drum. The compressor, I'm actually hitting that a lot harder than I normally would. I think we're hitting like at -7, something like that. I'd probably typically be around -2, -3, but thought for demonstration purposes, -7's good. And then you could hear when I turned it off and on, that bass got a lot fuller with the plug-in on. It just kind of sat more evenly, all those kinds of things. All right, so let's check out what this sounds like if we put an instance on each track throughout our session. And that's how I like to use channel strips when I'm recording, basically treat it like a recording console, whether I do much of anything with it or not. So you can see I have on all my kick drums, my snare, you know, toms, overheads, all that kind of stuff, bass, acoustic guitar, and electric guitar. Right now I don't have vocals or anything like that, so this is kind of a bare bones session right here, but you get the idea. And on a lot of these, I'll have some EQ. Again, I'm just kind of turning this overload light red on transients. It's not distorting so much, it's kind of just flickering. And then compression's usually around 1 dB on this. The only exception to that is the bass guitar. So I'm going to turn it on, bypass it, so forth, and you can hear what it sounds like. Now, one thing to look out for while we're looking at this is if you look at the master bus meter, when the plugins are bypassed, you'll notice that actually, especially the snare drum and those transients, they're actually louder on the meter. And when I turn the plugins on, in my opinion, it sounds fuller, sounds louder. However, those peaks are lower. And so the compression, the saturation, all those things are kind of just taming everything for me and keeping everything a little bit more in check. All right, so let's take a listen, starting with the plugins off. All right, so definitely adding a lot of character and things like that. To me, it sounds a little bit more polished, sounds a little bit wider, more detailed. I'm sure a lot of that's a bit of the EQ and things like that. But again, I'm not doing anything crazy, just subtle moves across the different tracks to kind of push them more in the direction that I would like my tracks to sound like. Again, this is a great plugin to use in this way, especially with something like a Volt 2 interface. And again, this plugin plus a bunch of other plugins come free with the Volt 2. So if you're looking for your first interface or just to upgrade from something like a very beginner starter interface, this is a great budget-friendly interface that will get a whole lot done for you. In fact, I use this all the time and I have left a full review of it right here. So definitely check that out. Also, YouTube thinks you might be interested in this video right here. Thanks for watching and we'll see you in the next one.